Welcome to this module, which is titled Sunday, the Basis of the Liturgical Year. The previous module, we looked at Sunday, the Lord's Day, and we saw biblical and theological evidence marshaled quite succinctly to explain the importance of Sunday. What I want to do in this module is I want to get archaeological. Okay, we've done biblical, we've done theological. I want to get archaeological in this module and get a little dusty, a little dirty, and just take you to one of the most important archaeological sites of one of the finds of the early 20th century, to a place called Dura Europos, to look at how Sunday was celebrated in the early church, how the Lord's Day was celebrated in the 2nd century. So we're going to look at that. I want to take you to this place a little bit later in this module. But in order to really appreciate what's going on at this place called Dura Europos, let's look at Sunday in the New Testament and just one biblical theological explanation first in this module, and then we'll go to this place that I think you'll find really interesting called Dura Europos. Okay, Sunday in the New Testament, the Lord's Day in the earliest days of the church. How was this celebrated? Where was the Sunday liturgy celebrated in the days of the New Testament and in the earliest days of the church? Well, we know from several citations that the earliest Christians met in each other's homes for the Sunday liturgy. They met in each other's homes for the Eucharist. There were no churches built, not initially. Remember, Christianity starts as this very fledgling, almost ragtag group of folks that come to believe that Jesus is truly risen from the dead. It starts off as one small, tiny religious movement in the wider context of the Roman Empire. So they're not building churches at first. Doesn't make sense to do that when you just have these tiny fledgling communities. Instead, what they're doing is they are meeting in each other's homes for Sunday Eucharist. And we have several citations of this from the New Testament. In Acts 20, verse 20, Paul talks about the teaching that is taking place in the homes of the early Christians. Now, it's not just teaching. We're going to see that it's even more liturgical than just teaching. We're going to see that in Romans 16:5, Paul is going to get much more explicit. He's going to ask that greetings be given and that the kiss of peace be extended to the church that meets in the home of Prisca and Aquila. The church that meets in the home of Prisca and Aquila, or Aquila, it's tomato, as far as that guy's name is pronounced. Finally, there's a reference in the letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verse 15, to Nympha's home and the church that meets there. And in the letter to Philemon, there's only one chapter, but chapter 1, verse 2, Apphia and Archippus' home is mentioned as a place where the early Christians gathered, as a place where the early Christians came together for the liturgy, to break the bread and to pray and support each other. So the earliest Christian celebration of Sunday happened in the homes of fellow Christians, perhaps the more affluent Christians who had a little bit larger house. That's where they all decided to meet. But the point is, Sunday is celebrated not in churches, I should say, but rather in people's homes. For 200 years, it goes like this. For 200 years, we don't really have churches. For 2 centuries, we have Christians simply meeting in each other's homes to break the bread. The breaking of the bread is perhaps the earliest depiction or description of the Eucharist. If you look at Acts chapter 2, verse 42, this really explains or describes the heart of the early Christian experience. Acts 2, verse 42, the Christians devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles and to the communal life, to the breaking of the bread, and to the prayers. Now notice what all is contained in just this one verse. the early Christians devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles. That's the roots of the Catholic magisterium. It's the teaching of the apostles that gets handed down in the Catholic Church, that the bishops as successors to the apostles continue and develop and refine. So the teaching of the apostles is one of the key things that the earliest Christians devoted themselves to. Not only that, but to the communal life. Well, think about it. I mean, that's your parish, isn't it? The communal life, the shared Christian fellowship that takes place in our parishes. Well, back then they didn't have churches yet, so the communal life was experienced especially on Sunday in people's homes. To the breaking of the bread, obvious reference to the Eucharist there. This is the heart of the early Christian experience, the breaking of the bread, coming together to celebrate the liturgy, and to the prayers, to their private, personal, devotional life. Really, we have the heart of Catholic practice here in this one verse, where we have the earliest Christians devoted to the teachings of the apostles, to the communal life, to the breaking of the bread, and to their personal, private prayers. For 200 years, this pretty much defines and describes the Christian experience. There's no Christmas being celebrated yet. There's no Advent. There's no Lent. The liturgical year hasn't developed yet. The saints' days haven't been decided upon. Instead, it's pretty much Acts 2:42, with the breaking of the bread being celebrated in people's homes, where they devote themselves to the teachings that have been handed down to them, and to their prayer life, and to their communal life. 200 years, that's pretty much Christian experience. That's every Sunday is really the heart and center of the Christian life for 200 years now. It starts to change about mid-3rd century, and I can prove it to you. I'm going to take you now to a place that is easily one of the most important Christian finds, Christian archaeological discoveries of the early 20th century. I want to take you to a place called Dura Europos. And so I hope through the magic of Google Earth that we are on our way to Dura Europos. And you can see that we've landed here. We are in the easternmost part of what's today Syria, but then it was the easternmost part of the Roman Empire. Dura Europos. It was really a fort. It was the outmost military post that existed in the Roman Empire. Dura Europos was the outermost military installation that the Romans set up to, again, watch over their frontiers. Right on the other side of the river is Persia. So Dura Europos is a fort, a military settlement that is built right on the banks of the Euphrates River. Right on the other side of the river is Rome's ancient and dreaded enemy, the Empire of Persia. So obviously, Dura Europos is going to be the early warning site for if Persia starts to try to make incursions into the Roman Empire. Dura Europos is right there on the forefront that would take the full blow, and then of course would communicate what's happening to the rest of the empire. Now this is a really spectacular archaeological site. Let me explain to you why. We see that Dura Europos was this outermost fort, this military establishment. Around the year 246, it becomes encircled by the Persians. Remember, before this, the Roman Empire was in its ascendancy, and it was conquering the known world around the Mediterranean, at least. It starts to weaken, the Roman Empire does, and now the Persians see their opportunity to reassert their dominance against their ancient enemy. And so 246 AD, the Persians march against Dura Europos, and they have the fort surrounded, and the Romans know what's going to happen. They know that they are in for the battle of their lives. And so what they do is, there's a city wall that protected the fort. What they start to do is they start to fill in this area right behind the city wall. What they're trying to do is to give themselves more of a barrier between themselves and the Persians, but also gives them a little bit more room to maneuver and to fight. And so what they do is they start to fill in this area right behind the city wall of the fort. Now what's especially interesting for us is that right next to the city wall, right across the street from it, was an ancient Jewish synagogue and what is, so far at least, the oldest known Christian church. Now let me just show you a floor plan of this. You can see here on this map, it says Wall Street at the top. That's exactly what it suggests. On the very top we have the city wall, and then there's a street right that runs right underneath the city wall, and then we start to see these buildings across from Wall Street. So what the Romans did is they filled in this whole area. They filled in the entire area from behind the city wall, that would include Wall Street and all of these buildings, up into Area A. And so they filled this in with dirt and rocks and rubble and whatever they could do to build the whole territory up to the top of the wall, giving them room to fight and to engage the Persians once they came crashing over their city wall. So, happily for us, buried under all this rubble is the earliest Jewish, well, not the earliest Jewish synagogue, one of the earliest Jewish synagogues, but definitely the oldest Christian church that we have. It was discovered back in the 1920s by some Frenchmen, and with help from scholars from Yale University, they've excavated all of this. And again, this was one of the most important Christian archaeological finds of the early 20th century. What do we see inside this? Let's just, first of all, let me take you through these two structures, and then I'll break it down and give you a little bit more detail. So you see Wall Street there, and then you see this outline of the building in bold. That was the Jewish synagogue. But although it's a very early Jewish synagogue, what we have for sure is the earliest evidence of a Christian church. Now, why is this the earliest evidence? Remember, in the New Testament, they're meeting in each other's homes. Now, they're not modifying their homes. They're not changing their homes in the New Testament. They're not remodeling. They're simply meeting in each other's living rooms. And so there's no evidence of church building from that time. Instead, what we have here is not a home, but the earliest home that's been completely repurposed to be a church. So in the days of the New Testament and right after, they're not changing their homes into churches. They're just meeting there. They're just opening the doors to their fellow Christians, and they're meeting in each other's living rooms. Here we have the first evidence of a house that was entirely remodeled and changed into an actual Christian church. We have the earliest Christian church, evidence of it, so far discovered right here. All right, let's look at this slide, and we'll see a little bit more detail of the Christian buildings here. If you look down at the lower left-hand corner, letter A, this was the entrance. So you notice right away there's a wall there, a little privacy wall. So you come into this little room and you don't really see anything yet. You have to go up and turn and make a left-hand turn, and then you come into the courtyard. So this was very standard residential building back then. Even today in Italy, they build around a courtyard, and there's a lot of open air living today, and just like today, same thing back then. So this was the courtyard that you walked into. Then if you notice, go a little bit further up on the right-hand side, you enter another room, and then there are stairs up, and they've added this. You can see that this has been remodeled. It's different on the upper right-hand corner than it is from the left. They've remodeled this into an upper room, just as we hear in the synoptics of the Last Supper celebrated in the upper room. They've made one. They did this on purpose. They remodeled this into an upper room. Now, what's up here was not the celebration of the Eucharist. What it is the celebration of baptism. If you look a little farther under letter E, you see an arch. And then inside this arch, for sake of privacy, this is where baptism would have been celebrated. Now, back then they didn't baptize infants so much like we do today. adult baptism was the standard back then. I'm not saying they didn't baptize infants, but the norm was adult baptism. And if parents became Christian and were baptized, there's no reason to think that they didn't baptize the infants as well back then. But still, adult baptism was the norm, and so for privacy's sake, men would be baptized separately from women for obvious reasons, because they are completely stripping and they are going down into the water bath without any clothes on. So obviously, for reasons of propriety, there would be a separation and a need for privacy up there in the corner. Then if you look over in the middle, upper right section, letter F, there's just a catechetical room. This is a room for religious instruction. This is where they did their adult ed, or where they did the RCIA, or wherever they did Sunday school. They wouldn't have called it that, but that's would have been celebrated there, or at least occurred there, would have been religious instruction. Then over on the far left-hand side, section G, notice they've enlarged that room. They've taken walls down. They've made it bigger. They estimate they could have had about 70 people in this part of the building. This is where the liturgy would have been celebrated. Now, what I think is especially interesting is if you look against the wall, that's where the altar was. The altar was against the wall, and so the priest would have celebrated the liturgy with his back to the people. Or let's put that more positively. They all would have been facing the same direction. Priest and people would have been facing the same direction. We call that ad orientem, that posture facing the east, if possible, where everybody is facing the same direction. Now, you can see here they're not facing east, they're facing west. Again, it wasn't a hard and fast rule, and depending on the city or the site, sometimes you just can't make the church work out that way. But here, they are still facing the same direction, but the altar is put against the wall. Here we have, again, the oldest physical evidence, the oldest archaeological evidence for an actual parish center, an actual church. Not just somebody's home. This no longer functions as a home. Instead, they've remodeled this home to serve one purpose, to be a church, a parish, for the early Christian community before 246 AD, because that's when this place was destroyed by the Persians. That's when all of this was filled in by dirt and rubble, so that, in preparation for the battle, again, the Persians destroyed everything above ground, but this survived underneath all those layers of dirt. Let's look at some of the frescoes. I want to take you inside and show you a little bit more of the detail. We have some of the oldest surviving Christian art inside this church of Dura Europos. So here we see the baptistry, and you can see that archway. That's, now we're up in the upper part of the room. And the baptistry there to that arch, so baptisms would have taken place there. And then we have frescoes. Now, a lot of them have been lost. They've been able to restore some of them and piece some of them together. But we have one of the earliest depictions of Christ as the Good Shepherd. So here you see him. It's hard to make out, I know, but I think you can see the figure of Christ with the sheep over his shoulders. The shepherd who goes off in search of the one sheep that has strayed, leaving the 99 behind. The image of Christ the Good Shepherd, the oldest depiction of Jesus. We have earlier Christian symbols like the fish, like the anchor. We have earlier Christian symbols, but this is the first figural depiction of Jesus Christ the Good Shepherd. Then there are some more frescoes down that I'd like to show you. Here we have I love this image of Christ healing the paralytic. This is the first depiction of a gospel story that we have, at least the oldest surviving one. Jesus is in the center. He's the central figure there. It's a little hard to make out, but let me explain it. In the right-hand corner, you see the paralytic lying on his mat. And then on the left-hand side, he's got it strapped to his back, but he's standing up. He's picking up his mat and he's walking home. And here you have just a magnificent depiction of this scene from the Gospels. Now, I'll come back to it in just a second, but let me show you one other fresco from the Jewish synagogue, not from the Christian church, but from the Jewish synagogue. And then I'll return to this image and try to make some points. Let's look at one of these frescoes from the synagogue. This is the meeting of Esther, Queen Esther, inside the Jewish synagogue. Look how artistic this is. Look how refined this is. Look at how sophisticated this is. This art is of an entirely different order than the depiction of Jesus healing the paralytic. I mean, it's beautiful, it's sophisticated, it's refined, but still, why Queen Esther? Well, remember who Esther's married to. She's married to the king of Persia, Ahasuerus. And remember, right across the river is the Persian Empire, so it makes a lot of sense that the Jewish synagogue would put up this picture of this beautiful fresco of Esther meeting her husband. Now, again, compare that picture back to this one. What does this say about the early Christian community in relationship to the Jewish community? Perhaps the Christian community is poor. It seems that it could be from a different socioeconomic stratum. Don't want to read too much into that, but it's possible. It could also be indicative of the fact that Christianity still suffers from waves of persecution, and that the Christian community could be a bit more transient, a bit more underground, not as established as the Jewish community. And so we're speculating, of course, but the artwork here in the Christian depiction is much cruder, much less refined. Could be indicative of just a different socioeconomic status, but it could also be represent the fact that the Christian community does suffer from waves of persecution that come and go. Now, we're out quite a ways from the city of Rome. We're about as far away from Rome as one can get. And so there's speculation that maybe the persecution would not have been that pronounced this far away from the heart of things. So perhaps it's indicative of, again, a lower socioeconomic standing. But we're speculating. But whatever is behind the artwork here, I think it's still a treasure. And we treasure it because it is among the oldest Christian symbols and artistic depictions that we have. All right, let's look one more part of this Christian church at Dura Europos. If you look up on the sides of the wall, you can see how the plaster has fallen away and much of it's been destroyed. They've tried to piece back together whatever they could. But what they discovered behind the plaster were some interesting examples of graffiti. Nothing untoward, of course, but there is writing in the plaster behind some of these artistic depictions. And the graffiti I just find so moving, but also it's important for our purposes to see how the liturgical life develops during the 2nd century. Some examples of the graffiti, they're all in Greek, but let me just give you the English versions here. Christ Jesus be with you. Remember Proclus. Another one says, Christ be with you. Remember Cession the humble. I don't know how humble Cession actually was, if he refers to himself that way, but he's writing in plaster and nobody can see it, so it's back behind some of this imagery. I guess it was covered up enough that he could still be humble and say that. May Dorotheos be remembered is another example of graffiti. And why does this matter? Well, I think what we see here is a desire for these Christians to be remembered by the community during Eucharistic or sacramental celebrations, that they may be living or dead, but even if they're dead, they wish to still be remembered by the other members of the community. They want them to still pray for them. And so this is starting to show us that more than just a Sunday celebration is starting to develop liturgically within the early Christian community. It's before 246 that we see evidence of this, but we're starting to see Christian liturgical life and practice develop and expand. It's not just about Sunday now. There's something else. praying for the dead, praying for the faithful departed. Would they just do that on Sunday? I can't answer that question definitively here, but I can answer it definitively elsewhere. Let's leave Dura Europos and let's go back to Rome now, and we can see evidence of liturgical practice outside of Sunday here. Where we are now is in a martyrium underneath the city of Rome. What is a martyrium? Well, as the name suggests, a martyrium was an altar built over the top of the grave of a martyr. So we have an altar built over someone's final resting place. Some martyr who died, giving his or her life for Christ as a witness to Christ. Somebody who especially moved the early Christian community by their personal example. An altar is built over their grave or as close to their grave as was possible. Now, they wouldn't do this just for Sunday celebration. Again, they're meeting in each other's homes. They have other places that they would meet regularly for the Sunday Eucharist. If you're building an altar over the grave of a martyr, it's not for Sunday use. Instead, they are coming together, celebrating the liturgy on top of the altar over the martyr's grave, most likely on the anniversary of that person's death, or at other times during the year. They could certainly do this, but it wouldn't have been Sunday after Sunday that they would have done this. They had other places to gather as a Christian community for that. Instead, by building an altar over a grave of an early Christian martyr, they're obviously commemorating the anniversary of that person's death, or they're praying for that person after death at certain specific times and occasions throughout the year. Not just a Sunday celebration, but it's beyond Sunday. So we can see already now the Christian liturgical praxis and practice is expanding beyond just Sunday celebration. They are expanding to celebrating the anniversary of the death of a martyr. This is going to become the basis for the liturgical year, for the celebration of saints' days, for the celebration of martyrs, for all of the sanctoral cycle, as we call it, the celebration of the saints' days. It starts with the early Christian martyrs, and it makes sense. These would have been the people that would have most impressed and moved the early Christian community by their witness to Christ. So it makes sense that the early Christian martyrs would have led the way to a liturgical celebration and remembrance of them outside of Sunday. So the martyrium is proof that the liturgical life is expanding. It's developing, and it's moving beyond just a Sunday observance. This martyrium here comes from the year 200 AD, so we're a little earlier than Dura Europos, but we see a martyrium built here in a Roman cemetery. Now, the Romans wouldn't have noticed this. Again, they would have just thought that, it wouldn't have indicated a Christian practice here. There could have been any number of Greeks, pagans, Romans that would have set up altars to some unknown god or goddess. It wouldn't have attracted any attention to go out and do this. The Christians, of course, we know what they're doing. They are celebrating the Eucharist here, whereas the Romans and the pagan society at large would have just paid it no notice. It wouldn't have caught any attention to build this inside a typical Roman cemetery. Okay, there's something I would like to point out to you here. We're going to do this in much more detail later, and if you go with me to Rome, you'll see this for yourself. But a martyrium was built over the site of Peter's grave. We know Peter was crucified outside the city walls. He's crucified he's crucified in the circus of Nero, and then he's just buried in the cemetery right outside the circus, and we will do more of this in a later module. But what I want to do here is just show you what they built. They built a martyrium early on to honor the grave of Peter and to mark the grave of Peter, and here we have a depiction of it. We know that Peter was crucified 64 AD. Some go as late as 67, but the tradition is that he died during the persecution of Nero in 64 AD. By 150, this structure is built. This is called the trophy of St. Peter, and it's called the trophy because he wins the victory by giving his life as a martyr. But notice, this could serve easily as an altar right over the grave of Peter. So this would have been the first Christian monument to St. Peter. This would have marked the grave of Peter. It would have served as an altar for the celebration of the Eucharist over the grave of Peter, and it would not have stood out at all. When you look at where it was, out in a Roman cemetery, it would have blended in with all the other structures, all the other, grave monumentary, or monuments, graveside monuments, let me say, that would have been built all over all of the graves of the people around him. So it was hiding in plain sight. No pagan would have paid this any. It looked just like everything else, so it wouldn't have drawn any attention. But from 150 AD, this was there. And of course, the Christians were going to this site and they revered it. They knew exactly where it was, but they actually marked the site with this trophy, the year 150. Now, everything that has happened after this is all built on top of this trophy. St. Peter's Basilica, everything. We'll do this in more detail in a later module. But since I mentioned a martyrium, I just thought I'd show you this right here. This is the martyrium marking the grave of St. Peter. Okay, again, we're in the 2nd century. There are still waves of persecution. It's not continuous. They come and go. Christians are persecuted off and on throughout the 2nd century, and even into the 3rd century, we see waves of persecution. We also start to see the Christians obviously becoming numerous enough to earn the ridicule of the elite members of Roman society. One of the earliest graffiti satires, it's actually worse than a satire, it's quite offensive. This is Roman pagan mockery of early Christianity from the 2nd century. This is an ancient Roman parody of crucifixion. You can see, again, it's quite offensive, but they have a donkey crucified here. And this says Alexander worships his God in the scribbling here. And again, this is obviously meant to be an insult to Christianity. It shows that Christianity is becoming numerous enough and noticeable enough to earn the scorn of the dominant Roman Empire and the ruling elites at this time. So this graffiti, I show it to you because it's not just to sensationalize it, but it's also to show that Christianity is growing despite the persecution, despite the early Christian martyrs. Christianity is actually expanding and growing. Now we know all of this is going to change in the year 313. 313 AD, we have the Edict of Milan, and we have the legalization of Christianity by Emperor Constantine. 313, all of the persecution comes to an end. 313, Christianity is now officially recognized as a religion, and so the days of persecution are now thankfully ended. And to mark this, we have the figure of Irene, or Irene, if you want to use the Greek pronunciation there, with a dove and an olive branch. And notice the position in which Irene is standing with her hands up. There's a lot going on here. This is early Christian relief and gratitude. Right after the Edict of Milan in 313, peace has arrived, finally, to the Christian community, and that's what Irene means, is peace. And of course, we have a dove extending an olive branch to further symbolize the peace that has finally descended upon the Christian community. And we know it's a Christian community because notice the hands. The hands are up. The hands are in what's called the orans position. This is the praying position. This is the position that priests still adopt at Mass. When the priest says, "Let us pray," he stands with his hands like this in the orans position. It goes all the way back to the earliest days of our faith. Here we see someone in the orans position, palms up, expressing prayerful thanks for the peace that has finally been granted to Christianity. 313. Now things changed dramatically. After 313, now Christianity's legalized. Now, really, it's just like night and day, a quantum leap forward. Before, we didn't have churches. If Christianity is a persecuted religion, well, then it doesn't make sense to build buildings where everybody can spot you and round you up. We saw the fort way out on the outskirts of the Roman Empire, but that was so far flung that it wasn't easily noticed by the authorities in Rome. But all that's behind the Christians now. Come 313, Christianity is legalized, and so now we begin to build churches. Now that Christianity is legalized, basilicas are built. And Constantine, the Christian emperor, or maybe I should say the emperor who's favorably disposed to Christianity, he starts a building program unlike any that the church has ever seen. He builds magnificent basilicas in the city of Rome and in Jerusalem. In Rome, he builds the Vatican Basilica. So he builds a basilica, he builds St. Peter's over the grave of St. Peter's, and we'll look at that in more detail later. He builds the Basilica of St. John Lateran on the outskirts of Rome and gives that to the Bishop of Rome, to the Pope. He builds a basilica to St. Lawrence outside the walls. St. Lawrence, the deacon that we met earlier in a previous module, the Roman deacon who gave his life as a witness, he builds a basilica over the grave of St. Lawrence. He builds a basilica over the grave of St. Paul. So we have St. Paul outside the walls. Not only that, he builds a basilica in Jerusalem. He builds a basilica over the tomb of Christ, over Calvary, and over all of the area around Calvary. It's a huge basilica. And just as we saw earlier in this module, how the Romans really preserved that early Christian church by filling it in with dirt and just burying it, but by doing so, thereby preserved it. Same thing happened in Jerusalem. Once Jerusalem's destroyed in 70 AD, all of the rubble and the dirt preserved the sites of Christianity. Constantine comes along, and now all of that is removed, all the dirt is cleared away, and he builds a basilica over Calvary and over the nearby tomb in which Jesus was laid. We'll look at these basilicas in more detail later as well. But what I want to just say to you here, and I'm going to say this as a means of bringing this module to a close, it's once Christianity is legalized and once these basilicas are built in Rome and Jerusalem, that this really shapes the development of the liturgical year. Now we have church buildings in which martyrs can be remembered and saints can be remembered and Easter can be celebrated. And more than that, we have all of the ritual elements that we love and treasure in our liturgy. They start to develop now. Now that there's a church, a basilica, a space for it, now we have vestments. Now we have processions. Now we have incense. Now we have candles being carried. Now we have the processional cross. All of the elements that go into making up our liturgical expression today, they really come from this Constantinian era. Because now we have these churches in which symbolic action and ritual gesture, remember Module 1? Now these can be employed. And these can be utilized to recapture and to present the mystery of the Paschal mystery. So it's these two basilicas that really allow the Christian liturgical year and even the Christian liturgy to develop. Remember before, if they're just meeting in each other's living rooms, they're probably not having processions and they're probably not using incense and they're not doing all of those ritual actions because it's very simple in each other's homes. But once the liturgy moves outside of the homes of the early Christians into the basilicas of the early Christians, now all of the liturgical elements that we are going to continue to explore are utilized and pressed into service to create the liturgies that we have in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Eastern Orthodox Church as well. The liturgical life of the great church takes a quantum leap forward with the building of these basilicas by Constantine after the year 313 AD. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Of course, threaded discussion awaits you in your study group after you do the reading assignment, and I look forward to taking up the conversation with you there in the threaded discussions. Until next time, goodbye and God bless.